In what ways can you explore ethical issues and human emotion through speculative fiction? Ted Chiang will be here to talk about his new story collection, Exhalation. What's so terrifying about motherhood? Novelist Helen Phillips will tell us about her latest book, The Need. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Ted Chiang joins us now. He has a new short story collection, Exhalation, with 9 short stories, and is the author of a previous collection of short fiction, The Story of Your Life and Others, which was published in 2002. He has won roughly 27 awards for his short fiction, and listeners who have not yet read his work may be familiar with one of his stories, The Story of Your Life, which was adapted into a film by Denis Villeneuve called Arrival, which starred Amy Adams, Jeremy Renner, and Forrest Whitaker. But his new book is Exhalation, and we will mostly talk about that. Ted, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with another kind of writing that you have done, which is for a long time, in addition to writing fiction, you've also been a technical writer for software companies. What do you do as a technical writer?
Well, I usually write reference material for programmers. So my audience is people who are writing software themselves. And I guess I sometimes explain what I do is trying to translate ridiculously technical material into merely technical material.
For people who understand technical material.
Yes.
What appeals to you about doing that kind of writing?
Well, the reason I got into it was because, well, for one thing, I got a degree in computer science. But I was also interested in writing, and it seemed like a way to combine those two. But I guess another reason that I was really enthusiastic about entering that field was because I liked explaining things. I liked trying to make clear a difficult concept in a way that people who weren't familiar with it previously could really understand it. That is something that, I guess in some ways, it's sort of like a version of teaching. And I thought that's something that I could do, and I thought it was really important and useful.
What's interesting is that when you think about explanatory writing, and then you think about your fiction actually does not explain a lot. It's more exploratory in nature to me, raising more questions maybe than answering questions. And I'm curious if those are two different muscles and you're aware of that tension between those two things, or if you actually think there's more overlap than I'm seeing.
It is definitely true that they are radically different forms of writing. So there is almost no overlap between the two, except that they both involve sentences. One of the things that I'm trying to do in fiction is also to help people understand certain ideas which they may not be familiar with. I'm trying to convey something to them in a way that makes sense to them, that will resonate with them. So even though it is a vastly different type of writing, I guess I'm in some ways still trying to have readers experience the reaction of, I get it.
Some writers of science fiction seem to fall in love with their inventions, with the technology or the worlds that they build. It feels, at least to me as a reader, that what is capturing you is everything that comes after that.
I guess I think of my work as maybe not so much focused on technology or a particular technological invention as more with the idea of scientific exploration in general. And in my stories, I'm trying to dramatize a philosophical question. There may be some invented device which helps enable that, but the point of the story was not the device. The point of the story was to illuminate a philosophical issue.
I want to talk about one of the devices that you do use in one of your stories. In the last story in this collection, Anxiety is the Dizziness of Freedom, which is this prism. Tell us about what that prism is. And then I am really curious about, once you have that premise, the direction that you decide to take the story, because it's constantly unexpected.
The prism, it's a imaginary device for communicating with a parallel world. It allows communication with exactly one parallel world, and that was the world created when the device was first activated. So devices that were activated long ago, the worlds have diverged more dramatically. Devices that have been activated very recently, the worlds may be virtually identical. So it's a communication device that lets you exchange information with someone in the other world and compare and contrast what's different about the two worlds.
Where you end up quite quickly in the story, and I don't think I'm giving too much away because there's still a lot to discover in all of these stories, is the world of 12-step groups. And you think it's feeling like a little bit Fight Club, like people who are having trouble regulating their own use of these devices. And then again, I think without giving too much away, it turns into a kind of crime story. How did you decide where to take that premise of this prism and of talking to an alternate or a paraself? How did you figure out where to go with that story? And does it all immediately come to you? Or do you have that notion of this prism, what would it be like? And then does it take you a long time to sort of figure out, okay, I could use this story in many different ways?
It definitely took me a long time to figure out what exactly I wanted the story to be about and what this scenario would be. Initially, what I was thinking about was that I wanted to write a story about regretting one's prior actions or questioning whether one's prior decisions were the right ones, and what it meant to be responsible for something. In a philosophical sense, there's this question of what does it really mean to have been the cause of something? How do you know that you were the cause of it? How do you know that it wouldn't have happened if it weren't for what you did? Things like that, I think, are, in a way, questions that prey on all of us. So I was mostly trying to come up with a scenario which I thought would illustrate that in an interesting way.
That theme seems to run through a number of your stories, the idea of the past and fate and the changeability of our future, whether it's even possible. And people who either read the story of your life or saw Arrival know that that's very much part of it, our understanding of time and what the future is versus the past and how much we can or should play with it. And that comes up again in stories in this collection. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about the first story in the collection, which it's not set in the future even. Some of your stories feel set in the future, but they're really about the past. This one feels set in the past and is about the past. Can you talk about The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate and the premise of that story?
The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate is a time travel story set in medieval Baghdad. It's sort of styled as a story in the tradition of 1001 Nights. What I was trying to do there was write a story about time travel in which it's impossible to change the past. And the thing is, most time travel stories that we see where it's impossible to change the past, they are usually downbeat stories. It's usually implied that it's a tragedy that the protagonist was unable to change the past. And I was interested in trying to write a story in which it was not possible to change the past, but it wasn't a tragedy. It didn't end on a downbeat note. I thought that an Islamic setting might be an interesting way to do that because acceptance of fate is one of the major pillars of the Islamic faith.
You find that out as a reader in story notes that you include at the end of this collection for each story. You have a few paragraphs, sometimes a little bit longer or shorter, depending on the story, about what inspired each story, what informed each story. Why did you choose to include those story notes in the collection?
There are a couple of reasons. One is that when I was young, I read some collections that had story notes in them, and I always found them really fascinating. And if I read a volume of Best American Short Stories, that's an anthology series which does include story notes at the back. And I continue to find those very interesting. The other reason is that there's a conversation to be had about stories. If you give a public reading, and then there's a Q&A period afterwards, people in the audience often ask some version of the question, how did you get the idea for this story? they want to have a conversation about the story, but they're not exactly sure how to start it. So they ask that question. And I'm not sure that that is always the best way to start that conversation. And so to an extent, the story notes are my version of starting that conversation. Sometimes it's about how I got the idea for the story, but sometimes it's different. Because I think sometimes the best way to start that conversation is by raising a different question. And that's what the story notes are trying to do.
This collection has a few stories that really stood out to me. One was The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate. The other one I want to talk about, and then there's a third, is The Life Cycle of Software Objects, which is the longest story in the collection. Tell us what that's about.
So that's a story about raising artificial intelligences over a long period of time. The characters in it find themselves by accident spending many years caring for artificial intelligences, which have a lot of similarities to children. And so they find themselves in a parental role raising these AIs from infancy to maturity.
The main character, the non-AI main character, is a woman named Anna Alvarado. And one thing I found interesting, so she had worked in a zoo with real animals before taking a job at this company that creates these AIs. I thought it was a really interesting way that you opened up this story with her flubbing a job interview, because I couldn't quite figure out. Your stories feel very well thought out, very well structured. And I'm curious what it is that you were trying to say about her character, that then becomes important to the story in opening the story that way.
The reason I wanted her to have a background of being an animal trainer for a zoo is that that's a profession in which you need to have a lot of empathy for a non-human intelligence. And also, I think that the relationship between humans and conscious software, if we ever create conscious software, I think the relationship between humans and that software could probably be best understood as being similar to the interaction that humans have with animals. So, someone like that would probably be in a good position to be an effective trainer of conscious software. And, we don't have conscious software. We are nowhere near getting conscious software. But if we ever do create conscious software, I think we won't really know what is the best way to interact with it. We have certain models for interacting with other sentient beings that are not fully capable humans. So, there's interaction that people have with animals. There is the interaction that adults have with children. There's even the type of interaction that people have with developmentally disabled people. So we have all these sort of separate models for dealing with someone who is not fully competent. And when dealing with this hypothetical conscious software, we won't know which is the best model. We'll probably try and fit all of these models onto it in some part. And I don't think any of them will be a really accurate model, a really good way of interacting with them. But I think it might involve elements of all three. So some of what is happening in the story is the characters trying to figure out what is the appropriate way to interact with conscious software. Are they more like pets? Are they more like children? Are they more like developmentally disabled adults? In various ways, they might be like all of them. And also, that means, in an important respect, they're like none of them.
I thought it was a very interesting exploration of empathy and that longing for connection, but also the urge to be a caregiver and the tensions between being a caregiver of something versus having a different kind of relationship that you might have with an equal or with a peer. And I read, correct me if I'm wrong, the opening with Anna Alvarado not getting a job is sort of we're setting the stage that this is someone who is temporarily deprived of that role as a caregiver. She's vulnerable. She's longing for connection. And so she's almost the perfect prime customer, or in this case, creator, for that kind of sentient artificial being.
Mostly what I was thinking of is that she is surprised at the job that she's being offered because it's using a skill set that she has, but it's not the skill set that she was thinking that she'd be using in this industry. She's changing careers. Now she's being offered an opportunity to maybe use some of the skills from her previous job. Initially, she doesn't actually realize just how much it's going to resemble her previous job. No one, even the people offering her the job, they don't really realize how much it's going to resemble her previous job. In some ways, it's kind of dumb luck that someone at the company thought, oh, yeah, someone who worked as an animal trainer, that maybe that would be useful. Because, again, it's a completely new situation. It's not something that anyone has ever encountered before. So everyone is sort of wandering around blindly, grasping in the dark, because it's a situation without precedent. They're almost stumbling upon this person who has a background in animal training, and that turns out to be a good fit in at least some aspects.
You're talking about the technology in this story, the life cycle of software objects as being a long way off. But the technological innovation at the heart of another story feels like it's not that far off. And that story, and for me, I think the most powerful story in the collection, to my mind, is The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling, in which the technology is that people can record every moment of their lives, but a new service is offered called Remem, which allows people to sub-vocalize some kind of earlier scene, like, say, the dinner that I was having with Julie, and there was an interesting painting on the wall, and you can then review that scene from your memory. But the places that you take that story, that idea, again, are so interesting to me. And then that story is interwoven with another story that takes place in a very different, presumably Africa, in a different period. Can you describe that story and what you were trying to do?
The hypothetical product in the future set storyline of Truth of Fact, it's a kind of search engine which gives you the ability to call up the recording of any past moment of your life very effectively. It lets you home in amongst the thousands of hours of footage to the moment that you want. It's a way of crystallizing what was previously amorphous. Our recollections in the past are indistinct in a lot of ways, and the hypothetical technology in the story makes it very concrete and specific. What I wanted to do was draw a parallel between that and another technological innovation from the past, which was the introduction of writing to an oral culture. So the other storyline is set in Nigeria in the early part of the 20th century, when writing was being introduced to a previously oral culture. And one of the things that writing did was it also fixed something that was previously amorphous. In an oral culture, when people don't have writing, a community's recollection of its past is subject to a certain amount of distortion in the way that we as individuals distort our recollections of the past. When writing was introduced, it caused a certain shift in the way that communities thought about their pasts. And I think that the new technology that I'm positing, this Remem, its effect on an individual and an individual's recollection of his or her past, there will be a similar shift. It will require a comparable revision of our understanding of ourselves.
I'm curious because you have many fans of your work and you've won so many awards. You have 2 collections in a period of about 25 or 30 years. The question your fans always want to know is, why not more? We would like more. In the past, you've said it's because you're slow to come to ideas. And I'm curious if that is in fact the case. And then if once you have the idea, is the actual writing from there quick, or is that also a slow process for you?
It's slow all the way down. Every aspect of it is painfully slow. I wish I could write faster. There's no one who wishes I could write faster more than I do. But despite my best efforts, I remain a very slow writer. And it's not easy being a slow writer in a world that demands a high rate of output. But this is the only way I know how to do it. So I'm resigned to it, I guess.
You've written mostly short fiction and a novella. Do you ever think about writing a novel, or does short fiction feel like your natural form?
Short fiction does feel like my natural form. I'm not opposed to the idea of writing a novel. And if I got an idea, if there was some philosophical question that I thought could only be explored in a novel-length piece of fiction, then I would try writing a novel. But I think the ideas that I get are ones that I know how best to address in short fiction. So for the foreseeable future, I think I'm going to stick with short fiction.
There were a couple of stories in this collection. As I was reading it, I thought, okay, I could see this becoming a film. And I know another story of yours is, I think, in development to become a film. I'm curious about the experience of having the story of your life become the movie Arrival, from sort of beginning to end, like when you knew it was finally happening. And I know these things take a while. Were you filled with dread, with excitement, with worry?
As you said, these things take a while. And, one of the things that I came to appreciate over that period of years is that you're never sure it's actually going to happen.
Right.
You hear stories from other people about movie projects that seemed like they were definitely going to happen, and then they didn't happen. So one of the lessons that I was trying to internalize was that you shouldn't expect that it's actually going to happen until the movie is actually done. I was hopeful, but I knew that there were no guarantees.
What did you think of the final film?
I was very happy with the final film. I think it works well as an adaptation of my story and as a film in its own right. I am conscious of just how incredibly fortunate I was that it turned out so well. We've all heard horror stories, authors' work being adapted for film and it turning out very badly. So it is almost literally a miracle that the movie came out so well.
I wouldn't ask this question if I didn't think the movie were that good. I have to ask, since it did feel like a work of art in its own right, did you learn anything about your own story through the way it was retold in a different medium?
I wouldn't say that I learned anything about my story, but the movie is doing some different things than the story. And I think that a lot of the positive response to the movie has to do with the things that were added in the screenplay that were not in the original story. There's a theme of language as a means of diffusing international military tensions. That is not something that was present in my story, but I think that is something that audiences really responded to in the film. I think, that's one of the things that makes the film effective.
Writing stories subsequent to that film, do you at all think about what if this were a film? Does it ever influence your writing? Or do you think about, if this were adapted to film, I would like to work on that as a writer?
No. One of the things that the film process made clear to me was that I have no idea how to adapt a piece of written fiction into film. I would never have picked Story of Your Life as a candidate for film adaptation. I realized that my sense of what would make a piece of fiction a good candidate for film is completely off. I think I would be, just a very bad judge of that. The experience really confirmed my sense that, I don't know anything about making movies.
Well, you do know something about short fiction. I'm assuming you were either writing another one or contemplating writing another one, and that I will have to be very patient along with other readers and listeners, but we'll do so willingly.
Well, thanks.
Thank you so much for being here and for talking about the new book, which is called, again, Exhalation.
Thanks so much for having me.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
Well, this week, what are we talking about?
So since you sit next to me in the office, you know that I'm low-key obsessed with the Russia investigation in the Mueller report. And funnily enough, it is touching on the publishing industry quite a bit this year. So Robert Mueller gave his testimony in Washington this week. It was widely watched, and publishers have really taken advantage of interest in his report. If it's a public domain document, so several publishers were able to print it essentially as a paperback, which is, pretty economical. They didn't have to pay for an advance or anything like that, and the sales were extraordinary. So the edition that was put out by Scribner this April, which has an introduction by two investigative reporters at the Washington Post, Rosalind Helderman and Matt Zapotowski. That is more than 575,000 copies in print, which is really astonishing.
Wow.
It's been on our paperback bestseller list for weeks and counting, and that's not the only one that's selling really well. There's another edition from Skyhorse, which has an introduction from the Trump defender, Alan Dershowitz, who's a constitutional law scholar, and that has more than 300,000 copies in print. And a version published by Melville House, I believe that one doesn't have introduction, it's just sort of relying on the document itself, has sold 75,000 copies. So when you look at that, those are huge numbers for nonfiction, for fiction, for anything, and at a very low cost to publishers. Essentially, they just have to print it. There's also a ton of free versions since this is public domain. There's a free Audible narration. The Digital Public Library of America produced an enhanced ebook, which has links to all the documents referenced in footnotes for super nerds who really want to get in there on the indictments and things.
Have you been in there, Alexandra?
Not yet. I'll tell you the one that I did buy in addition to I have copies of the Scribner and Melville House ones that the publisher sent me, but I couldn't resist the Mueller report, which is the Mueller report with cartoon cats. And it's literally just volume 1 and volume 2 of this nearly 500-page report with cartoon cats interspersed, which they kind of do help when you're thinking of stuff like, a foreign adversary interfering in our democratic process. It's nice to have like a little cartoon cat kind of rolling around on the page.
Cartoon cats help with many things, many reading experiences.
I know. I was thinking we should just add them to everything in the public domain. And there's spoofs. There's a graphic novel that's coming out. There's a Mad Libs one where readers can fill in all the many redactions and make guesses at whose names are covered up. There's an illustrated picture book, which is being promoted as a book for grown-ups who haven't read the full report. And there's a ton of summaries, which are 12 to 17 pages, just sort of boiling it down. So it's been a weird boon for the publishing industry this year, and an unexpected one.
I'm guessing, however, that Mueller himself is not writing a book.
That would be extraordinary, and I'm sure publishers would throw all the money they had at him. But yeah, the man is an emotional cipher and seems to hate the spotlight. If you caught any of his testimony, he looked extremely uncomfortable and said very little. So the idea of him writing a tell-all is pretty far-fetched, although I would certainly read it.
I think we should send him a copy with the cats.
That's a good idea.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Helen Phillips joins us now. Her new novel is called The Need. It is her second novel for adults. Her first was The Beautiful Bureaucrat. She's also written collections of short stories and a book for children. Helen, thanks so much for being here.
Of course, my pleasure.
So tell us a little bit about The Need.
You could call it a domestic thriller with some science fiction and speculative elements and also a couple of breast pumps. But it begins with a paleobotanist named Molly who's home alone with her two young children when she hears an intruder in the other room. And we go from that primal moment of fear to once she discovers who that person is, it really challenges everything that she thinks she knows about her identity and her life.
All right. There's a lot there. I want to start actually with her job. Her job figures into the plot of the novel, but also just this idea of a paleobotanist, right? Because a paleobotanist is someone who examines life, but like life that is no longer there, life that is already dead. And I'm curious if there was any meaning in that choice of career for her.
From the beginning of the process, I knew that Molly would have a job that involved digging into the layers of the earth and finding things from the deep past. I wasn't sure if she would be an archaeologist or a paleobotanist. Initially, But then my mother-in-law knows a woman whose daughter is a paleobotanist, and I got on the phone with that woman for 2 hours, and I took 9 pages of notes, and I realized that Molly had to be a paleobotanist because this professor of paleobotany taught me something that I hadn't known before, which is that paleobotanists regularly come across fossils that don't make sense to them, fossils that don't match anything in the current flora or in the fossil record. So our fossil record of plants is incomplete and will always remain so. And so the idea that Molly has a job that involves so much inherent mystery really tied in well with the themes I wanted to explore in the book, that there are so many things you can't know even when you're an expert in something. Just as when you're a parent, there's so much you can't know about the endeavor of parenting a human. And at one point late in the book, Molly realizes a photograph is a fossil. She's looking at a photograph of her children, and she says a photograph is a fossil. So that was one moment where I really wanted to have that direct tie into both the history of fossils and then all of the different stages of parenting you go through that kind of slip into the ether away from you.
Well, we also think of scientists, and this is a gross generalization, but here you go, as these, methodical, rational, sort of very earthbound people who would not be imagining something.
Yes, and it was important to me that Molly be a scientist, that this really outlandish adventure that happens to her happens to someone who actually we do associate with being grounded in logic and rationality. And I guess I was really working against the idea. I didn't want Molly to seem hysterical in this book. I mean, that's a negative word that we often associate with women. And she's going through things that would make anyone hysterical, but I wanted to give her a solid grounding in terms of what her professional identity was. And I think that also there's a lot of duality in the book, but one duality that we can experience as working parents is you might be calm, rational, competent at work, and then you go home and you might no longer feel calm, rational, and competent when confronted by what is going on the home front.
Well, that gets back to your talking about identity and identities in the plural and the sort of way in which this is a novel about a woman wrestling with those various identities.
Yes, that was very central to me to explore in this book, obviously. Molly enters a situation where everything that she takes for granted about who she is and what her life is will be profoundly challenged. Everything that she takes for granted, she will have to question and fight for.
We are very anti-spoiler on this podcast, and this is yes, it's a slender book. There's a lot that happens. I don't want to give too much away, but in a way that you are comfortable with, it's sort of teasing it a little bit. What is the situation that she finds herself in? What happens?
So, as I mentioned, there's an intruder in her home, and she ends up having a confrontation with this intruder in which the intruder asks something of her that forces Molly to make a really difficult ethical decision. The central question of the book for Molly and for the reader, I think, is it possible to take someone else's pain and grief as seriously as you take your own pain and grief? The thing that the intruder asks of Molly involves the children and in Molly's mind, potentially puts the children at risk. So it's a very high stakes ethical dilemma.
All right. We were going to stop with the plot.
Okay.
Let's go back to sort of where you began this novel. What inspired it?
So the book is dedicated to my older sister, Catherine, and she died when the same summer that my daughter was born. My daughter was 8 weeks old when I lost my sister. And so that was a time of such bounty and love and intensity with having a newborn, and then such grief and loss for my parents and for myself. And so again, going back to the idea of duality, just the contrast in that time in my life of new life and new death. And I knew that was something that I had to find a way to write about, the coexistence of joy and grief, which I think a lot of people experience all the time, obviously. And that mix of emotions, I needed a whole novel to try to think that through. And probably you could use 10 novels to think it through. Another crystallizing moment that ties into the very beginning of the book is I was home alone nursing my daughter when she was a few months old, and I thought I heard footsteps in the other room, as Molly does at the beginning of the book. And in my case, thank goodness it was no one, but it did send me into this primal anxiety of what would I do if I am here nursing this vulnerable little person and there was someone else in the house. And so hence you have the beginning of the book.
You have a lot of those thoughts as a parent that, like, what if this happened? What if that happened? That sort of constant, like, catastrophizing or, worrying about a catastrophe that I don't know necessarily happens, at least not to that degree until you are a parent. And it feels like the book is a lot about that feeling of impending doom.
Well, having children really changed my perspective on the role of imagination in evolution, because I've always been someone who enjoys using my imagination. But once I had children, part of what I did is just what you're saying. You imagine bad things happening in order to prevent them. So I assume there's some evolutionary purpose to imagining terrible things happening to your children so that you can stand in the way of those things happening. I had never, until I had children, had that perspective on why humans might have such active and even at times overactive imagination.
Those, like, intrusive thoughts of child tumbling down the stairs. I mean, it does give us a kind of illusion of control, just going through that thought process, thinking, okay, now that I've imagined that horrible scenario, I know that I could actually do something about it.
Yeah.
All of that is in itself illusory.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, yes, you could put up the child gate or you could move the boiling pasta water to the back burner, but there are still things that you can't protect your children from, and you don't want to protect them too much. I mean, this overactive imagination is important in some cases to keep them safe, but you don't do anyone a service, I think, if you keep your children overly safe. You have to let them take their own risks. And there is actually a moment in the book that really gets at that, which is at one point when towards the end, this is not really a spoiler, everyone gets really bad stomach virus. And the daughter, Molly's daughter, 4-year-old daughter Viv, wakes up screaming, "I want mommy, I want mommy, I want mommy." And she's having one of those night terrors.
Right. Those are the worst.
They're the worst. They're so creepy, and it feels like the child is possessed. So Molly picks up her daughter and holds her close and tries to comfort her, but the child is still screaming, "I want mommy, I want mommy, I want mommy," while Molly's arms are around her. So that feeling, I have had this experience of the night terror, and there's nothing you can do for your child in that situation. So that really illuminated for me, both in my personal life and in the book, the limits to your ability to protect your children at times.
Okay, for non-parents who have not experienced the night terror, what is what is a night terror, just very briefly, compared with a regular nightmare? Like, why is there nothing you can do?
I don't really know the medical difference, but your child will have their eyes open so they seem like they're awake, but it's like they're having a hallucination of sorts. And my understanding is that if you wake them up during a night terror, it's really, you actually aren't supposed to wake them up. You're just kind of supposed to soothe them back to sleep. My daughter has only had a couple of them, but it is at a different level from a regular nightmare. It's not just like, oh, I thought a shark was eating me. It's so visceral, and the child's whole body is taken up in it. And it's a very eerie thing to witness. I wouldn't recommend it.
It makes you wonder why there aren't more horror novels or movies around this idea of the night terror. And earlier when you were describing your book, you said it's like a domestic thriller with some speculative elements. You didn't use the word horror. And I'm curious, did you think consciously of your book sort of incorporating certain elements from that genre?
It's fascinating to me, as early readers have called it horror, and I do find it hard. I said domestic thriller with a little bit of a twinkle in my eye because I do find it hard to precisely categorize the book, but horror was not something that was front and center in my mind as I was writing, so it's been very fascinating to me that has been, and I very much understand why people would read it that way. My reaction is a little bit, this is the content of my mind, and then people call it horror. I don't know what that says about me. But I do think that the inherent situation of being in a vulnerable position with an intruder in your home, I can see why that takes people in a horror direction. And certainly, as I was trying to express, as I described to you, these feelings of loving your children so much and being so scared of losing them, I felt like I had to pull on lots of different genre elements, like thriller, like science fiction, in order to capture something that for me almost defies expression.
One of the things people have remarked upon with this book is the way in which motherhood is like science fiction, that you use these various genre elements to get at something about motherhood that they haven't seen necessarily captured in similar books. And I'm curious, who do you think has written about motherhood in a way that you have found illuminating or thought-provoking?
The most profound book for me about motherhood is Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin.
She's an Argentinian writer.
An Argentinian writer, yes. And that book, it's a very short book. And I read a little bit about her process. It used to be much longer. But it has the momentum. For me, it has the momentum of a thriller or a horror story. It has this description of the idea of rescue distance, that the mother in the book is always measuring the rescue distance between her and her daughter. How many steps would she have to take to rescue her daughter from something? And in that book, she actually fails to rescue her. So that book, for me, that was such a big influence on me. I believe that Samantha Schweblin did not have children at the time she wrote the book, which I find quite astonishing because she captured the exact feeling that I write about in The Need better than anyone else I've ever read. That book was meaningful to me because I felt like it was exploring motherhood and messing with genre and playing with genre.
I don't want to reveal anything about the plot, so we're just going to pull this out of thin air a little bit. It's somewhere in your book, the notion of doppelgangers. And I'm curious, why doppelgangers? Because also, I feel like they're constantly bubbling around in the culture, most recently in the film Us. My own favorite is The Nose, the Gogol story. But what is a doppelganger? Like, why does that interest us, and why does it interest you?
I think because, for me, it can be a metaphor for the idea that other people in the world are just other versions of us.
Mm-hmm.
And we're all kind of stuck and marooned in our own little worlds. But in a sense, humans are doppelgangers of each other. We each have the same body parts. Mm-hmm. And when you make it a literal echo of you, like a literal person who looks like you, it brings that to the fore. And I think it raises a question, is this doppelganger my greatest enemy or my greatest ally? Is another version of you someone who understands you better than anyone else in the world and can support you, or is that someone who is a threat to your very being? So I think it's so complicated. You know, it's exciting to think of someone being like you, and it's horrifying at the same time. And certainly Molly experiences that in the book.
It's funny because in fiction and in film, at least in the stories that I'm most familiar with, the appearance of doppelgangers, it's less finally my long lost twin and more, oh no, this other version is sort of dead set against me. Earlier, you talked about identity and in a way that person sort of threatens your own identity, that doppelganger.
Yes. And I think that Molly toggles between these different feelings in the book. Again, talking about the duality in the book, I think that sometimes we can feel like doppelgangers of ourselves. You know, you are one person in one situation, you're one person at work and one person at home. And in the code switching that all of us do in our daily lives, it's almost like different versions of us emerge. And the doppelganger just makes that concrete in a way, makes it literal in a way that I find a helpful way in order to really explore the different sides of our own identities.
Let's end by bringing readers a little bit into the book. Let's hear a little bit from the audiobook version of The Need.
The audiobook is narrated by Alexandra Allwine. So this is the first chapter of The Need.
She crouched in front of the mirror in the dark, clinging to them. The baby in her right arm, the child in her left. There were footsteps in the other room. She had heard them an instant ago. She had switched off the light, scooped up her son, pulled her daughter across the bedroom to hide in the far corner. She had heard footsteps. But she was sometimes hearing things. A passing ambulance mistaken for Ben's nighttime wail. The moaning hinges of the bathroom cabinet mistaken for Viv's impatient pre-tantrum sigh. Her heart and blood were loud. She needed them not to be so loud. Another step. Or was it a soft hiccup from Ben? Or was it her own knee joint cracking beneath 36 pounds of Viv? She guessed the intruder was in the middle of the living room now, halfway to the bedroom. She knew there was no intruder. Viv smiled at her in the feeble light of the faraway street lamp. Viv always craved games that were slightly frightening. Any second now, she would demand the next move in this wondrous new one. Her desperation for her children's silence manifested as a suffocating force, the desire for a pillow, a pair of thick socks, anything she could shove into them to perfect their muteness and save their lives. Another step. Hesitant, but undeniable. Or maybe not. ...
Dot.
Dot, dot, dot.
All right. That will definitely leave listeners, I think, wanting to hear more. Helen Phillips, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Helen Phillips' new novel is called The Need, reviewed this week in the Thrillers issue of the New York Times Book Review. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Gal Beckerman, Greg Coles, and John Williams. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Greg, let's start with you.
I'm reading a novel called Trust Exercise by Susan Choi. It's her fifth novel, and it's been fairly polarizing among readers.
Certainly among our two critics.
I was going to say, even here at the Times, Dwight Garner really liked this novel. He said it was her best to date. And Elizabeth Egan, in the pages of the Sunday Book Review, felt very betrayed by it because there's a turning point about halfway through where the perspective shifts. It essentially becomes two novels. The first part of it is a coming-of-age novel set in a performing arts high school in an unnamed southern city that's probably Houston. Choi as much as says so in the acknowledgments, but it just feels like the New South. It could be Atlanta. It could be, any kind of nameless urban sprawl, New South city. And it follows the very melodramatic relationships. Not that the writing is melodramatic. To the contrary, it's very austere and precise. But because it is an adolescent story, the relationships among these characters, and not just adolescents, but performing arts adolescents, there's a lot of drama. And in that part of it, Choi really captures kind of the purity of teen anguish and this kind of adolescence keening and heartbreak. And then it shifts, and you get an adult perspective looking back, who's not the author's perspective or the protagonist of the first, but a different character kind of filtered through that person's consciousness. I'm not done with it yet, so I'm not going to weigh in on the Dwight Garner, Elizabeth Egan
Oh, no, you
divide.
must. You have to say where you're leaning.
I'm leaning
You cannot get away.
I'm at this point leaning more toward Dwight than to Elizabeth Egan, because I don't feel betrayed by it. Partly I knew it was coming from having read the reviews, and partly it's the kind of thing that you're used to. It doesn't feel cheaper or more gimmicky than, say, Atonement, where it's one character, somebody recasting events from the past in an attempt to redeem herself. And yet I'm early enough in the second part that it still feels a little destabilizing, and I am waiting to see if it will take even another turn or how it will play out. I'm really enjoying it, and it recasts the first part in enough ways that it calls into question this whole notion of fiction and its relationship to reality. So, good book so far.
We'll see if you turn. All right.
It calls into question the relationship between fiction and reality. Gal, you are reading just pure reality.
That's right. I am reading Rick Atkinson's The British Are Coming. Atkinson is a military historian. He's probably best known for his Liberation trilogy, which was a series of books he did about America's role in World War II. Now he's gone even further back in history to the Revolutionary War, and this is, like I said, the first volume. He looks at the first 2 years of the war. The subtitle is From Lexington to Princeton. And he does what we've come to know him as doing so well, which is he bores down really tightly on the reality of what it meant to fight in this war. It covers all the details from, what the soldiers were wearing to the weapons they were using to the very kind of minute kind of tactical details of how the battlefield kind of was laid out. And you really get a sense of what it meant to be there. And for me, who, I know what the Revolutionary War was. I know, obviously, how it turned out in the end. But I don't know that I knew the details of many of the battles. And particularly, I just finished a section about Brooklyn, about the battle that took place in Brooklyn, where the British kind of went through Brooklyn to end up capturing New York and then occupying it for most of the war, actually. And it was fascinating to read about these things that were happening on the grounds of where I live.
One thing that struck me when I was reading in the early parts of the book, he's talking about Lexington and Concord, and we of course know, pivotal events. I didn't realize how tiny the battles were. There were like 9 casualties.
Right.
It was really it was more like a, I can't remember the word he used, but it was more like it wasn't like, he didn't use the word upset, but it was more like a,
and
a bar brawl.
That's right.
Well, the population was smaller then.
Right.
Indeed.
But you do get a sense that they almost like bumbled into the war.
Yes.
Because that was an early battle that wasn't expected. It caught the British by surprise, how ready and how passionate colonists were at the time to kind of take them on. And one of the things that's interesting is like you because he's so focused on the details of how the wars are fought, you get a sense of what was really important in terms of winning each of these battles. And it's not the things that you might think about. It's how much gunpowder they had, the number of provisions. The British are constantly suffering from the fact that they need to get boats to bring over just food, food and clothing. And that's a real logistical problem that he focuses on that you wouldn't normally think about, but it plays a real pivotal role in the war itself. And when they have their first big victories in New York, it's largely because there's been enough time for enough boats and enough men and enough provisions to come over.
You think about that verse in Hamilton where it's like 32,000 ships in New York Harbor.
Right.
And that, which is such a powerful refrain because it's unimaginable.
Right.
That many boats. Have any of you seen the documentary that came out last year, They Shall Not Grow Old, by Peter Jackson?
No, I want to, though.
No.
It is really, it's worth seeing, but it's very powerful. It's just looking at World War I footage and using the direct quotes from participants, from veterans of that war. That's the only dialogue. There's no other narration. And what Jackson did with the footage is he digitally manipulated it to fill in the gaps. There weren't as many frames per second, in film taken in that era, and to enlarge it and colorize it and then add in audio so that it's sort of similar to what Atkinson, I think, is trying to do in this book, which is to make very real battles that to us somehow feel, so far removed from what we see today.
Can I ask a question as somebody who doesn't know a lot about U.S. history, who maybe, didn't pay enough attention in that part of the high school class? This war was essentially a civil war. I mean, there were British sympathizers among the colonies. And so were they not providing Britain with provisions?
They were, first of all, the notion of it being a civil war is very much kind of his focus. He really wants to recast our understanding of the Revolutionary War as being a civil war. And also he spends a lot of time on the British side. He actually starts the whole book in England, and you really get as much perspective from what's the British side. As to your question, I have to draw on my AP US history. No, the book is teaching me that there are definitely parts of the country where there's more British sympathizers, more loyalists who are trying to offer support. In the South, for example, there's a few battles where they play a very big role, but decisive in certain circumstances, but overall there's many, many more colonists, who are fighting.
Interesting. That struck me too when I was reading the Atkinson, the fact that he starts in England, and it reminded me of a book that I talked about on the podcast about a year ago, The English and Their History by Robert Toombs, which also had its period where it looks at the American Revolution from the perspective of the British, and you really see it a totally different way from the way that it was taught to us.
I remember our review of the Atkinson points out how much work went into paving a political groundswell of support for the war before it ever became military. So to like kind of town by town, the American side of things tried to win people over to the cause of independence.
Right.
I do find that reading these histories now, not just during our current political moment, but just as an adult, having been brought up on the Schoolhouse Rock version of, American history and of the Revolution, it really is striking. And even if you studied it in college, it's striking to think about it that essentially it was about taxes. It was about representation, but a lot of it really was about, it was like a real tax rebellion. And to think about that in the context of current politics sort of strips away, I think, some of the mythology that at least I grew up with.
I think about that a lot.
John, what are you reading?
I'm reading something very, very different. You guys have really, although now I'm stuck in this high school mindset after all that talk of U.S. history. I'm going to ask for the bathroom key in a minute. After I did this recent project with our staff critics about the 50 best memoirs of the past 50 years, I'm kind of in this. I'm sure it'll peter out at some point, but I keep reading memoirs. I'm catching up on things that I've been meaning to read. And the one I read most recently is called Love and Trouble by Claire Dederer, and it came out in 2017. Dederer is a journalist and a critic and the author of another book about yoga called Poser, a memoir about her life in yoga, which now I want to read, but I haven't.
This wasn't on our 50 best, though, was it?
No, it wasn't. But it's quite good. And what's most interesting to me about it in a solipsistic way is that Dederer was, I think, around my age while she was writing it in her mid-40s. And it's about two things. It's about the feeling she has that she's getting a bit bored in her marriage in ways she didn't expect, because at first she was very happy, and then now she kind of feels, she does feel a little bit of an itch to maybe experiment with other people. And she's also remembering her days in her 20s when she was sexually experimenting and when she had a fairly active social life. Okay, so she's a woman recounting those things. I am a man who had, if it's not sharing too much, a fairly chaste 20s. And obviously I am not married. I am not looking for experimentation inside a marriage. And yet there was something about the phase of life she's in that really echoed in me. The idea of being in your mid-40s and having the space now to think of yourself as literally a fairly different person 20 years ago and dealing with that feeling inside yourself. She's a very good writer. She goes from sort of semi-traumatic moments that happened to her when she was younger that inspire her to write these open letters to Roman Polanski, which are part of the book, to more comic moments, to a kind of mapping of Seattle when she was in her 20s and all the cool spots people used to hang out in. So it's a mix of cultural writing, personal writing, writing about sex and romance, and it's not very chronological. It kind of slips back and forth through time, and it's very casual while being very stylish and well-written. So I found it good company, and I also found it an interesting way to look at, I guess, for lack of a better term, middle age, which is a chilling thing to say about myself. But I really enjoyed it. So maybe I'll pick up the yoga book, even though I have even less experience with yoga than with some of these other subjects. Pamela, what are you reading this week?
I'm also reading about middle age. I am reading...
And marriage.
Yes. I am reading Fleischman is in Trouble by our colleague Taffy Brodesser-Achner. And she has said that this is a book about essentially middle age. That is her subject, even though it started off as a dating novel, then became a marriage novel, and ended up being a divorce novel. But that more than anything else, it's about middle age. And, I have to say, obviously, I don't say this because she's a colleague of ours, and she's also been on this podcast, and has also, physically threatened me if I don't say this. But no, she hasn't. But it's really good so far. I'm about halfway through, and it's interesting. I don't normally think about myself because I am not a fiction writer, and I don't think I will ever be a fiction writer. It just feels like a very different skill set. But because she is what I think of as one of us, like she's a journalist, it's easy for me to relate to her, or I think about her as someone like us doing this other thing. Yeah. And therefore, I find myself wondering, how is it that she does this thing? And what I have to say is that I think she really is a novelist. It feels like she is unleashed on the page, like she unconstrained by the facts, unconstrained by New York Times style, which she's always had her a very strong voice. You feel like she's really breaking out and writing what it is that she wants to write and is meant to write. Readers of the Times know her primarily from her profiles, although she does other kinds of writing too. But she profiled Gwyneth Paltrow and Jonathan Franzen in the Times, among others. And I think she's very good at that. But what strikes me most about this book is her observations and her voice, which again comes through in her journalism, but really here comes out. Her humor. It's really, really funny. And all the blurbs and many of the reviews compare her with people like Maria Semple and Nora Ephron and Philip Roth. And you hear that and you're like, no, really, though, But in her case, you can see why people are making those comparisons, because there's a really strong comic voice in here that I feel like has not been out there that much in contemporary literature. Like, I feel like she's filling up, she's inhabiting a space that to me is sort of not as prevalent in contemporary fiction recently. I don't know if you
agree with that. Yeah.
She's not afraid to be funny. I think it's hard to be funny right now. There are a lot of
taboos.
There are a lot of taboos. There are a lot of political limitations and social and cultural limitations. And just as she is very deft at finding a voice that is, she's confident and yet self-deprecating in person, and listeners of the podcast probably can tell that about her. There's a huge amount of confidence in her voice here and in her sort of right to tell these stories in these ways and to have that humor. Have any of you read this?
I've read it. Yeah, I also love there's a lot of great sociology in the
my
book
God.
about especially about the kind of New York economic caste stuff, that you have this main character who's a doctor who's, what is he making, $200,000-$300,000,
right,
and
which is like poor,
and everyone is looking at him as poor. And I didn't doubt that that's probably the case of somebody living in that situation. But just the way she describes these various kind of gradations of wealth in a city like New York, I thought was and led to a lot of great humor too.
Yeah, I think she's very good at the very granular sociological distinctions of what does it mean in the 1990s to have worn a ribbed sweater, and when she mentions that detail, it's that at some point in the 1990s she registered that sweater and filed it away. And I was saying to another colleague of ours this morning that I felt like when reading Taffy, and again, I'm only putting myself in her shoes because she's sort of walking around our office, I was thinking, if I were to take all of my funny witticisms that I've ever thought and poured them into a debut novel, it would be 14 pages long. I couldn't sustain it beyond that. But I feel like she either she is seeing these things at every second of the day or taking note of them, or she's just able to conjure them up. But you feel like not only are they in here in abundance, but you could see her doing it again.
I think she is doing it again.
She is doing it again.
As much as I agree with you, she's a born novelist, I think she's also a born profile writer, and she brings a lot of those same skills to this book, to the psychology of this book. And I think that it's those same skills she's able to apply equally to both tasks.
But I love something she actually said on the podcast about when writing fiction, not having this feeling of responsibility to be kind to the characters.
Yes.
So she could just kind of
tell
it the way she felt. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
She doesn't have to be responsible.
I don't know how far you are in the book, so I don't want to give any spoilers, but that's also a book that makes a shift, like Trust Exercise, the book that I'm reading right now.
Be quiet. Our listeners haven't read yet either, perhaps.
But that's a good place to start, Greg. Let's go over what we read again.
I'm reading Trust Exercise by Susan Choi.
Rick Atkinson's The British Are Coming.
I read Love and Trouble by Claire Dederer.
And I'm reading Fleischman is in Trouble by Taffy Brodesser-Akner. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague, John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.